It's been 36 hours, and Southern California has not stopped shaking. 347 earthquakes all clustered along a 36-mile fault corridor at the southern end of the San Andreas Fault. The rate is still accelerating, but the detail drawing the most attention from geologists right now isn't the number. It's the silence inside the swarm. 2 dense clusters of seismic activity, one at each end of the zone, and between them 12 kilometers of almost nothing. No events, just a quiet gap sitting perfectly still while everything around it shakes. In seismology, a silent zone inside an accelerating swarm isn't reassurance. It's a question, and that question points due north, to a 200-mile fault that hasn't moved in over 300 years. The most overdue major rupture in California. Stay with me. The gap is where this story gets serious. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The event. The ground beneath Southern California has not stopped moving for the past 36 hours. Not once, not even for a second. Since Saturday morning, more than 347 earthquakes have torn through a 36-mile corridor in the Imperial Valley, a stretch of cracked earth that most people drive through without a second thought on their way to somewhere else. The magnitudes have ranged from 1.0 to 4.7. The rate started at a manageable hum and then climbed. 22 events per hour, then 28, then 33 per hour as of the last monitoring window. And here is the thing that should be making every seismologist in California sit up straight in their chair. The rate is not slowing down. It is accelerating. The ground is not calming, it is winding up. Now, before you panic, and I want to be clear about this, a magnitude 4.7 is not a dangerous earthquake. You feel it. Things fall off shelves. Your dog looks at you with that particular expression of philosophical betrayal. But you are fine. Your house is fine. Nobody is calling emergency services because of a 4.7. We have to be honest about that, because this story has a habit of getting misread in 2 opposite directions. Either dismissed entirely because the magnitudes are small, or blown up into something apocalyptic because the number 347 sounds like the end of everything. Neither reaction is the right one. What is happening in the Brawley Seismic Zone right now demands something harder than panic and something more serious than dismissal. It demands attention. Careful, specific, focused attention. Because the earthquakes themselves, they are not the story. The story is what they are touching. The Brawley Seismic Zone sits in the southeastern corner of California, directly south of the Salton Sea, hard against the Mexican border. It is one of the most seismically active regions in the entire western United States, not because of a single dominant fault, but because of what the crust looks like down there. The zone sits at a structural junction where the San Andreas Fault, the largest and most famous fault system in North America, passes its stress southward into a tangle of smaller faults before the plate boundary dives into the Gulf of California. Think of it as a relay station. Stress comes in from the north, gets processed through a fragmented web of microfaults, and passes south into the Imperial Fault and eventually into the Cerro Prieto system across the Mexican border. The Brawley Zone is not a single crack in the earth. It is dozens of cracks, all talking to each other, all crammed into a thin, hot piece of crust that sits at the edge of a rift zone. It is, structurally speaking, one of the most complicated 36 miles of real estate in North America. And right now, 347 earthquakes are lighting that entire zone up simultaneously. What makes this different? What makes this worth an hour of your life? Is not the number, or the magnitude, or even the location in isolation. It is the combination. It is the fact that this swarm is not behaving the way a swarm is supposed to behave. It is the fact that the spatial geometry of this swarm, the way it has organized itself in space, has produced a configuration that geologists find interesting for exactly the wrong reasons. It is the fact that 36 hours into this sequence, the rate is going in the wrong direction. And it is the fact that this specific zone, this exact relay station, sits at the southern end of a section of the San Andreas Fault that has not produced a major rupture in more than 326 years. 326 years. The last time that section of the San Andreas Fault released its stored energy, the city of Los Angeles did not exist. The United States of America did not exist. The Spanish mission system in California had barely started. The crust in that region has been accumulating strain through the entire history of the American nation, and then some. Every year that passes, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grind past each other at roughly 2 inches per year, and every inch of motion that does not produce an earthquake is stored. It is saved up. It goes on the ledger, and the ledger for the southern San Andreas Fault is now 3 centuries deep. So when you see 347 earthquakes light up the zone directly connected to the southern end of that fault, the end where the stress enters the system, the question is not, are these earthquakes dangerous? The question is, what are these earthquakes doing to the fault that is already at the edge of its limit? That is the question. That is the only question that matters right now, and we are going to work through it carefully, because the answer requires you to understand a few things about how earthquake systems actually work, not how they are portrayed in movies, not how they feel from the outside, but how the physics of stress actually behaves in the crust of the Earth. Because once you understand that, the picture gets a lot more interesting. And by interesting, I mean the kind of interesting that keeps seismologists checking their monitoring feeds at 2 in the morning. There are 3 questions I want to anchor this entire conversation to. First, why is the rate accelerating instead of fading? Second, why here, of all the places in Southern California? And third, why now? Those 3 questions do not have comfortable answers, and that discomfort is not hysteria. It is just honest science looking at an anomalous pattern and admitting that the pattern is anomalous. Because here is the thing about earthquake swarms. They are supposed to tell you something. The question is whether we are smart enough to hear it. 347 events and counting in a 36-mile corridor at the foot of the most overdue fault rupture in California, with an acceleration curve pointing in the wrong direction, and 4 minutes after the largest event in the sequence, a federal monitoring agency issued a warning that was, geographically, completely impossible. We're going to get to that. But first, we need to understand why this swarm is already behaving like something that should not exist. The 347 earthquakes started Saturday morning, not with a bang, not with a single large event that cracked the crust and sent a cascade of smaller aftershocks radiating outward. That would have been easy to read. That would have fit a pattern scientist know and understand. Instead, the sequence began as a distributed murmur across the entire zone. Many events, roughly similar in size, spread across a corridor nearly 36 miles long, with no single dominant rupture to explain any of them. No main shock, no source, just the ground, simultaneously deciding to move in a dozen different places at once. That is the first sign that this is not a normal sequence, and understanding why requires a quick detour through the physics of how earthquakes usually work, which we will take in the next section. Because the difference between a normal aftershock sequence and what is happening in Brawley right now is not just academic. It is the difference between a system releasing stress and a system redistributing it. And redistribution is the scenario that keeps people up at night. The swarm is still active, the rate is still climbing, and somewhere beneath the Imperial Valley, the southern San Andreas Fault is sitting at 326 years of stored tension, listening. Part 2, not an aftershock sequence. Every earthquake has a signature. Not a fingerprint exactly, but a shape, a mathematical pattern that describes how the energy decays over time after a rupture. When a main shock hits, it releases a burst of energy and then sends out a family of smaller earthquakes called aftershocks. The aftershocks are not random. They follow a rule so consistent that seismologists named it after the Japanese scientist who first described it in 1944. It is called the Omori law, and it says that the rate of aftershocks decreases in a predictable, smooth curve over time. The bigger the main shock, the bigger and more numerous the aftershocks, but they always decay. They always wind down. The system always finds its way back toward quiet. There is another rule called Barth's law, which says that the largest aftershock in a sequence is almost always about 1.2 magnitude units smaller than the main shock. So if you have a magnitude 6.0 main shock, your biggest aftershock will typically be around magnitude 4.8. The hierarchy is predictable, the main shock is in charge, and everything else follows its lead. Now look at the Brawley swarm. There is no main shock. There is no single event that started this sequence and is now generating the smaller ones in a tidy Omori decay. The largest event so far, magnitude 4.7, is not dramatically larger than the dozens of other events surrounding it. The sequence is not decaying. It is not following any known mathematical curve toward quiet. Instead of a hierarchy with one dominant rupture at the top, you have something that looks more like a mob. Many events of roughly similar energy, erupting across a broad zone, with no single source and no clear leader. This is what seismologists call a tectonic swarm, and the distinction is not just semantic. A swarm and an aftershock sequence are fundamentally different things, produced by fundamentally different physical processes, and they have fundamentally different implications for what might come next. An aftershock sequence is the Earth healing. A fault breaks, releases its stored energy, and then settles down as the crust adjusts to its new configuration. It is stress release. The danger is in the main shock. Everything after that is the aftermath. A tectonic swarm is different. In a swarm, there is no single break, no single release. Instead, stress is being redistributed across a network of faults simultaneously. Multiple fault segments are moving at once, loading some areas while relieving others, with the energy jumping laterally between strands rather than radiating outward from a central point. The crust is not healing, it is rearranging, and in rearranging it may be setting up conditions in adjacent areas that make a larger event more likely, not less. The Brawley Zone has produced swarms before. This region has a documented history going back decades. In 2012, a swarm of hundreds of earthquakes peaked at magnitude 5.4 and then gradually faded. In 2020, a sequence near Westmoreland produced roughly 240 events, reaching magnitude 4.9 before winding down. Both of those swarms followed recognizable patterns. They peaked early and decayed. Noisy, but readable. The current swarm is not reading the same way. Both past sequences showed their highest event rate in the first 12 hours and then began the expected Amori-style decay. This one showed an accelerating rate after 24 hours. That is not the historical pattern for this region. That acceleration is the anomaly that has seismologists paying close attention, because it suggests that whatever is driving this sequence is not dissipating, it is building. Now, there are two leading mechanisms that can drive swarm behavior like this. The first is stress redistribution, basically one set of fault movements loading the next set through the mechanical transfer of crustal stress, like pushing on one end of a stick and watching the other end lift. The second mechanism is fluid migration. The Brawley Zone sits above a geothermal field with extremely high heat flow, which means there is pressurized fluid moving through the crust. When fluid pressure increases in a fault zone, it reduces the friction that keeps the fault locked, essentially greasing the hinges on a door that was already close to opening. Fluid-driven swarms can accelerate when the fluid migrates into new fault segments, which could explain the lateral jumping pattern we're seeing. The honest answer is that, in real time, it is almost impossible to know which mechanism is dominant. It may be both. The crust down there is hot and fractured and full of fluid, and the stress field from the broader San Andreas system is constantly loading the whole zone. What we can say is that the behavior, the acceleration, the lateral spreading, the absence of a dominant source, is consistent with a system that is not releasing stress cleanly. It is shuffling it. And here is why that matters for the question we are really trying to answer. Remember, the central San Andreas Fault, right there at the northern edge of this zone, has not moved in 326 years. Every earthquake in that swarm is a tiny perturbation in the stress field of a region, connected, mechanically and structurally, to a fault that is already carrying 3 centuries of accumulated strain. The swarm is not dangerous in itself, but the shuffling, the redistribution, that is the variable we cannot ignore. Because swarms do not usually escalate. Most of the time they just fade. The historical record is pretty clear about that, but sometimes, not often, not predictably, but sometimes they do not fade. Sometimes they are the opening act of something larger. The problem is that you cannot tell which kind you are watching in real time. The seismogram does not come with a spoiler. You watch, you measure, you build models, and you hold the uncertainty honestly. The acceleration after 24 hours is the part that is keeping monitoring teams watching. It is the part that does not fit the familiar script. And when a sequence departs from the familiar script, the responsible thing is not to assume it will eventually conform. The responsible thing is to keep watching the geometry, to look at where the earthquakes are happening and what the spatial pattern is telling you. because when you zoom out and look at where these 347 earthquakes are actually located, when you see the pattern they are making across that 36-mile corridor, it raises a question that is harder to answer than is this normal? It raises the question of what is happening in the place where nothing is moving at all. Part 3. The two-cluster geometry. Pull up a seismic map of the current Brawley swarm, and the first thing you notice is that it is not a single blob of activity. It is two blobs. Two distinct clusters of earthquake activity, separated in space by roughly 12 kilometers, sitting at opposite ends of the active zone. One cluster is anchored near the southern edge of the Salton Sea to the north. The other cluster is positioned near the Imperial Fault to the south. Each cluster contains dozens of individual events, stacked tightly together, forming two dense clouds of seismicity on the map. And between them, there is almost nothing. A quiet zone, roughly 12 kilometers across, sitting in the center of an otherwise furiously active swarm. No significant events, no clusters, just a gap, surrounded on both sides by hundreds of earthquakes, sitting there in the middle of the map like a held breath. That quiet center is the most interesting 12 kilometers in Southern California right now, and understanding why requires thinking about how stress behaves in rock under pressure. When you stress a material, any material, the failure does not always happen where you expect. Think about how a piece of bread breaks when you bend it. The ends flex. The center, where the maximum bending stress is concentrated, cracks. Or think about a tectonic fault the same way. You have two zones of active, moving slip at either end of a fault segment, and between them a section that is holding firm. That central section is not moving because it is strong, or it is not moving because the stress there has not yet reached the threshold that would cause it to fail. Or, and this is the interpretation that geologists are most cautious about, it is not moving because the stress there is accumulating, being loaded from both sides simultaneously, getting closer to its breaking point with every event at either end. There is a concept in seismology called a stress shadow, a zone that is actually shielded from additional stress by the movement happening around it. And there is the opposite concept, sometimes called stress concentration, where the activity around a locked zone actually adds stress to it rather than relieving it. Distinguishing between these two states in real time is genuinely hard. The sensors do not directly measure stress at depth. They measure ground motion at the surface and infer what is happening kilometers below. The gap could be a stress shadow, a region that is actually safer because of the movement on either side. Or it could be a stress concentration, a region that is getting more dangerous with every passing hour as the clusters at either end load it from both directions. The geometry has a historical echo that is difficult to ignore. In April of 2010, a swarm of small earthquakes activated in Baja California along a distributed zone of faults. Scientists watched it for several days. The activity organised into two distinct spatial clusters with a relatively quiet zone between them. Less than a week after the swarm began, a magnitude 7.2 rupture, the El Mayor Cucapar earthquake, initiated near the gap between the clusters and propagated outward. The swarm had not been a random collection of small events. It had been the system loading itself, failing at the edges of a locked zone while the locked zone itself accumulated stress until the moment it released catastrophically. Now. I want to be very careful here, because citing El Mayor Cucapar in this context is not the same as saying that the Brawley swarm is a foreshock sequence for an imminent magnitude 7. The two situations have real similarities in geometry, but the differences matter too. The Brawley zone is a different kind of fault system. The stress conditions are different. The crustal structure is different. Most swarms with two-cluster geometry do not end in major ruptures. The historical record shows far more cases where that geometry simply reflected the natural complexity of a fragmented fault zone. Two active sections responding independently to a common stress driver, with the gap between them being a structural feature rather than a locked seismogenic zone. But geologists do not look at that gap and feel relaxed. They look at it and increase monitoring frequency, because the gap is where a rupture would most likely initiate if this sequence were going to escalate. A rupture does not typically begin in the most actively moving section of a fault system. It begins in a zone of concentrated, unreleased stress, exactly the kind of zone that a quiet gap surrounded by active clusters suggests. There is also a tool called the B-value, a statistical measure of the ratio of small to large earthquakes in a sequence. A low B-value suggests high stress in the crust, because high stress tends to produce fewer small events relative to large ones. A high B value suggests the opposite. In swarm sequences, a declining B value over time is considered a warning sign. It indicates the stress in the source region is increasing rather than decreasing, which is inconsistent with a system that is simply dissipating energy. Real-time B-value calculations from the current Brawley sequence would require access to raw seismogram data that is still being processed, but the general principle matters. The spatial geometry and the temporal acceleration are both indicators that the stress field in this zone is not simplifying. It is getting more complex. And complex stress fields in zones directly coupled to 326-year locked fault segments are the exact kind of thing that seismologists are trained to watch with deep, careful, sustained attention. The most important question about this swarm is not what the active clusters are doing, it is what the quiet zone between them is doing. Because the ground that does not move is carrying something the ground that does move has already released. And in a system where every small movement is a potential nudge toward the locked San Andreas to the north, in a zone where stress travels through the crust like a message through a wire, the thing that is not moving may be more significant than the 347 things that are. To grasp what this actually means, you need to understand what the Brawley Zone actually is, not just geographically but structurally, what role it plays in the larger mechanical system that connects the southern San Andreas to the Imperial Fault to the crust beneath the Gulf of California. Because once you understand that role, once you understand that this is not a passive zone of activity, but an active mechanical relay in a fault system under 3 centuries of accumulated stress, the 347 earthquakes stop being background noise. They become something more specific, something more pointed. They become the sound of a relay station under load, doing a job it was never designed to do indefinitely. Part 4. The mechanical role of Brawley. The San Andreas Fault does not end cleanly. It does not reach the southern end of California and stop, like a road reaching a terminus. It transitions, fragmenting, transferring, passing its structural role to a collection of smaller systems that carry the plate boundary motion southward into Mexico and eventually into the spreading center beneath the Gulf of California. This transition happens in the Salton Trough, and the Brawley Seismic Zone sits right in the middle of it. To understand what the Brawley Zone is mechanically, you first need to understand the broader context. The San Andreas Fault is the product of 2 tectonic plates moving past each other. The Pacific Plate moving northwest relative to the North American Plate at roughly 2 inches per year. This motion is called right lateral strike slip, which means that if you are standing on one side of the fault and watching the other side, it moves to your right. This has been happening for millions of years, and has transported rocks from as far south as the Mexican border to as far north as Point Reyes, north of San Francisco. The plate motion is continuous. The fault system that accommodates it is not always continuous. It is broken, distributed, and structurally complex in several key areas. The Salton Trough is one of the most complex of all. The Salton Trough is the northern extension of the Gulf of California Rift Zone. The Gulf of California itself formed because the Baja California Peninsula, riding on the Pacific Plate, began rifting away from mainland Mexico roughly 5 to 6 million years ago. The rift extended northward, and the Salton Trough is where that rift system goes continental, where the pulling apart motion of the rift transitions into the side-by-side motion of the San Andreas system. This creates a condition called transtension. The crust is being both sheared laterally and pulled apart vertically at the same time. The result is thin, hot, fractured crust with an unusually high heat flow, a propensity for geothermal activity, and a fault architecture that looks less like a single clean break and more like a ladder. Parallel north-south strike-slip faults connected by shorter east-west cross faults, creating a grid of interconnected structures that distribute deformation across a broad zone rather than concentrating it on a single surface. The Brawley Seismic Zone is one of the primary structural features of this ladder. It sits between the southern terminus of the San Andreas Fault and the northern end of the Imperial Fault, and its job, if a geological structure can be said to have a job, is to transfer stress between the two. When the San Andreas system is loaded, stress does not simply jump directly from the San Andreas to the Imperial Fault. It goes through Brawley. It enters the zone, gets distributed across the network of microfaults, produces the kind of swarm activity we're watching right now, and passes southward. The zone is a mechanical transformer, taking concentrated stress from a large fault and spreading it across a distributed network before it reconcentrates on the next large fault to the south. This structural role has a critical implication. When the Brawley Zone is active, when it is processing a swarm, it is not operating in isolation. It is operating as part of a mechanical circuit. Stress is being imported from the San Andreas to the north, processed through the zone, and exported to the Imperial Fault to the south. The zone is a conduit, and what passes through a conduit goes somewhere. It does not disappear. The thin, hot crust in the Brawley Zone makes it particularly efficient at this kind of distributed processing. Hot crust is weaker and more ductile than cold crust, which means it can accommodate deformation through many small events rather than storing up for large ones. This is actually why the Brawley Zone is less hazardous than the San Andreas itself. The crust there cannot sustain the kind of long-term strain accumulation that produces magnitude 7 and 8 earthquakes. It bleeds the stress off continuously. Hundreds of small events, decade after decade, distributed across a network of faults, keeping the zone in a state of perpetual low-level motion. But that efficiency cuts both ways. A zone that transfers stress efficiently can also load the faults on either side of it efficiently, and the fault on the northern side of the Brawley Zone, the southern terminus of the San Andreas, is not bleeding stress off continuously. It is locked. It has been locked for 326 years, and every increment of stress that passes through the Brawley relay and finds the San Andreas end of the circuit already at its limit has nowhere to go. It accumulates. It stacks on top of 3 centuries of accumulated strain. It adds to the ledger. This is why the location of this swarm matters more than any other single factor. It is not just that it is near the San Andreas, it is that it is in the specific structural zone that directly mechanically couples to the most stressed section of the San Andreas. These are not adjacent features, they are connected components in the same system. The Brawley Zone activity is not happening next to the San Andreas problem. It is happening inside the plumbing that feeds it. The geothermal influence adds another layer of complexity. The Salton Sea geothermal field, one of the most productive in the United States, runs directly through the active swarm zone. The high heat flow means that fluid, pressurized, hot, mobile, is present throughout the fault network at depth. Fluid in fault zones reduces the effective normal stress on fault surfaces, which means it reduces the friction that keeps those surfaces locked. A zone with high fluid pressure is a zone where faults can slip at lower stress levels than they otherwise would. This is relevant because it means the Brawley Zone can react to stress changes that might not be large enough to generate swarm activity in a cooler, drier fault system. It is sensitive. It is a sensitive relay station, and right now, something in the system is sending a signal through it. The 347 earthquakes are not random. They are the relay station doing its job under elevated load conditions. They are the structural response of a hot, fractured, fluid-saturated transfer zone to an increase in the stress signal it is carrying. The question that follows from that, the question that leads directly to the southern San Andreas and 326 years of silence, is whether the relay is transmitting that stress forward or absorbing it. Because if the Brawley Zone is absorbing the excess stress, the story ends here, in a swarm that fades when the excess is dissipated. But if the relay is transmitting, if the stress is passing through the zone and loading the fault on the other side, then the story does not end here, it starts here, and the next chapter is 326 years in the making. Part 5. The Southern San Andreas Problem. There is a section of the San Andreas Fault that has been called, without much exaggeration, the most dangerous locked fault in America. It runs roughly from the Salton Sea northward, through the Coachella Valley, past Palm Springs toward the San Gorgonio Pass. Scientists refer to it as the Coachella segment. It is approximately 190 miles long. It sits within driving distance of tens of millions of people. And it has not produced a major rupture since approximately 1690 to 1700. Somewhere in that decade, paleoseismologists believe, the fault last broke in a significant earthquake, 326 years ago. To understand why this is remarkable, you need a frame of reference. The mean recurrence interval for major ruptures on the southern San Andreas, the average time between large earthquakes on this segment, based on the geological record, is roughly 180 years. That is how long, on average, the system takes to accumulate enough strain to produce a major rupture and then reset. 180 years is the average. The current gap is 326 years. The segment is not just overdue by a few decades, it is overdue by nearly twice its average recurrence interval. It has been loading for nearly twice as long as it typically does before breaking. The evidence for the last major rupture comes from paleoseismic trenching, a technique where geologists literally dig trenches across a fault zone, expose the layered sediments in the walls of the trench, and read the history of past ruptures from the disturbances in those layers. An earthquake leaves a signature in sediment: offset layers, collapsed channels, sand blows, fissure fills. By dating the sediments above and below these disturbance features using radiocarbon and other methods, scientists can bracket the timing of past ruptures with reasonable precision. The Coachella segment shows a clear record of past ruptures: approximately 1700, approximately 1500, approximately 1300, going back several thousand years. The intervals between those ruptures cluster around that 180-year mean. Every one of them has been followed by another, every one except the last. The last rupture was approximately 1700. The next expected rupture would have been somewhere around 1880, give or take several decades. That window came and went. The 1890 window came and went. The 1960 window came and went. The 2020 window came and went. We are now in 2025 and the Coachella segment has been silent through all of it. It is important to be precise about what happened in 1857. The Great Fort Tejon earthquake of January 9, 1857, magnitude estimated at 7.9, was a major San Andreas rupture that broke a 300-mile section of the fault running from Parkfield in the north to just north of the Cajun Pass in the south. It was one of the largest earthquakes in California's recorded history, powerful enough to cause the Kern River to run backwards temporarily. But it did not rupture the Coachella segment. The Fort Tejon earthquake broke the central San Andreas, the segment north of the Big Bend, and stopped short of the section we're talking about. The southern end of the fault did not participate, which means the southern end has been accumulating strain through the entirety of California's modern existence, through the gold rush, through statehood, through the construction of Los Angeles, through the growth of Palm Springs, through the development of the Coachella Valley into one of the most densely populated desert regions in the United States. The accumulated strain is real and measurable. GPS measurements across the fault zone show the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate diverging from their expected positions at rates consistent with several meters of accumulated slip deficit. The crust on either side of the locked fault is moving. The fault itself is not. The difference, the slip that should have happened in 326 years but has not, is stored elastic energy in the rock on both sides of the fault surface. That energy is not going anywhere. It is not dissipating. It is not leaking out in small events the way the Brawley Zone does. It is locked in, waiting. The Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, the state's primary probabilistic seismic hazard model, has been updated several times, and each update has maintained the southern San Andreas Coachella segment as one of the highest individual fault rupture probabilities in California. Without getting into specific numerical probabilities that require careful context, the model consistently identifies this segment as carrying among the highest long-term rupture probability of any single fault source in the state. This is not a fringe assessment. It is the consensus of the California Geological Survey, the United States Geological Survey, and university-based earthquake research programs. The fault is overdue, the strain is accumulated, and the probability of a major rupture increases with every passing year. What does major rupture mean in this context? A rupture of the Coachella segment alone, an isolated southern San Andreas event, would likely produce a magnitude in the range of 7.5 to 7.8. The shaking would be severe across the Coachella Valley, Inland Empire, and the greater Los Angeles basin, all within the rupture's strong shaking radius. The infrastructure exposure, highways, pipelines, water systems, hospitals, in that corridor is substantial. But there is a more concerning scenario. The southern San Andreas does not exist in isolation. It connects northward to the San Bernardino segment, which connects to the Mojave segment, which connects northward toward Parkfield and the Central Fault. A multi-segment rupture, one that initiates on the Coachella section and propagates northward through connected segments, could produce a magnitude 7.8 to 8.2 or higher. The 1979 scenario, modelled by researchers at the Southern California Earthquake Center, colloquially called the shakeout scenario, uses exactly this kind of multi-segment rupture as its primary planning earthquake, estimating casualties in the thousands and economic losses in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The scenario is taken seriously enough that California has organised the largest earthquake preparedness drill in American history around it. That scenario begins at the southern end of the San Andreas. It begins in the zone that the Brawley Seismic Zone feeds stress into. It begins at the fault that has been silent for 326 years. The swarm is not that scenario, let me be clear about that. 347 earthquakes in the Brawley zone are not the beginning of the shakeout scenario, but they are happening in the specific structural zone that directly loads the fault where that scenario begins. And they are happening in a configuration that is not behaving normally. Which brings us to the question we have been circling since the first earthquake lit up the seismometers Saturday morning. Can a swarm in the Brawley zone change the stress state on the Coachella segment? Can 347 small earthquakes matter to a fault that has been quietly accumulating the equivalent of 300 years of tectonic patience? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Small changes in stress can matter enormously to a fault near failure, and understanding why requires a detour through one of the most important and least discussed concepts in modern seismology. Part 6. Stress transfer. Small push, big consequences. Here is a question that sounds absurd until you understand the physics. Can a magnitude 4.7 earthquake cause a magnitude 8? Not directly, not as a simple chain of cause and effect. But can it nudge a system that was already at the edge of failure, and does that nudge matter? The answer comes from a concept called Coulomb stress transfer. It is the framework seismologists use to understand how one earthquake can change the likelihood of another, not by creating new stress in the crust, but by redistributing existing stress in ways that move some faults closer to failure and others farther away. The math is sophisticated, but the intuition is relatively clean. Every fault has a threshold, a level of stress above which it will slip. You can think of it as a cup filled almost to the brim. The question is not whether the cup is full, it is whether the next drop of water is the one that causes it to overflow. Coulomb stress transfer says that earthquakes add and subtract drops from nearby cups. When a fault slips, it changes the stress field around it. Some nearby faults experience a small increase in stress. They get a drop added to their cup. Others experience a small decrease. Some water is removed. The changes are typically small in absolute terms. We're talking about fractions of a bar to a few tenths of a bar. In comparison, the total stress that drives major earthquakes can be tens to hundreds of bars. A Coulomb stress change of 0.1 bar sounds insignificant, except it is not, if the cup is already 99.9% full, a fault that is close to its failure threshold, that has accumulated 326 years of strain against a typical recurrence interval of 180 years, is not a fault with lots of room in its cup. It is a fault where even a tiny increment of added stress could theoretically be the difference between slipping next decade and slipping tonight. Researchers have documented Coulomb stress transfer effects in numerous earthquake sequences around the world. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, the largest ever recorded in that country, occurred in a region where previous earthquakes had been calculated to have added Coulomb stress to the rupture zone. The 1999 Izmit earthquake in Turkey triggered a subsequent large earthquake at Dusci less than 3 months later, in a zone that stress calculations identified as positively loaded by the first rupture. The Brawley swarm is producing hundreds of small stress perturbations, each individually tiny, but collectively affecting the stress field across the region. Stress modelling of past Brawley swarms has suggested that the diffuse seismicity in the zone produces detectable Coulomb stress changes on the adjacent sections of the San Andreas, not large changes, but non-zero ones. The direction and magnitude of those changes depend on the specific geometry of the slip, the depth of the events, and the orientation of the receiving fault. For some configurations, the stress transfer to the southern San Andreas is positive, meaning it adds to the load on an already loaded fault. For other configurations, it is neutral or even slightly negative, without precise focal mechanism data for the current swarm events, data that takes days to fully process. We cannot calculate the net effect with confidence. But the principle stands. The Brawley Zone is not isolated from the San Andreas. They are connected mechanically. Slip in the Brawley Zone changes the stress field on the San Andreas, and the San Andreas, with 326 years of accumulated strain, is the fault where even a small change in the stress field is not trivial. The triggering framing often used in popular science coverage is actually somewhat misleading. The word triggering implies that a small earthquake causes a large one, that the small event is the source of the large event's energy. That is not how it works. The energy for a major San Andreas rupture is stored in the crust over centuries of tectonic loading. The small events do not create that energy. They do not fill the cup. But they can be the last drop. The classic analogy is a pile of sand. You can add grain after grain to a sand pile, and each grain is identical, and each grain is in that sense equally responsible for the final shape of the pile. But one grain, at some unpredictable moment, will cause an avalanche. Every grain before it was also necessary. The distinction between the grain that caused the avalanche and a grain that was just part of the pile is one that only becomes meaningful in hindsight. Scientists use this framing carefully because the public tends to hear triggering as causing, and that conflation leads to either unnecessary panic or, when the panic does not materialize, unwarranted dismissal. The honest scientific position is this. The Brawley swarm is occurring in a zone that is mechanically coupled to the Coachella segment of the San Andreas. The swarm is producing stress perturbations in the regional stress field. Those perturbations may be positive, neutral, or negative in their net effect on the San Andreas failure threshold. We cannot measure the current state of the San Andreas failure threshold with sufficient precision to know how close to failure it is. We cannot know whether the perturbations from this swarm are the last grains of sand or grains that are nowhere near the critical pile height. What we can say is that the conditions exist for this to matter. A 326-year locked fault, directly mechanically coupled to a zone of accelerating seismicity, in a region where stress transfer between fault systems is well documented. That combination means we cannot simply wave this swarm away with Brawley swarms happen all the time. They do. But this one is happening on an unusual timeline with an unusual geometry, in a zone coupled to an unusual degree of accumulated strain. The last grain is not a probability, it is a possibility. And in a system this loaded, that possibility is not negligible. Here is what you cannot know in real time, and what the scientists watching this sequence are sitting with every hour. Whether the current swarm is releasing stress from the southern San Andreas system, or adding to it. Whether the relay station is venting excess pressure or building it up. Whether these 347 earthquakes are the crust's way of keeping the larger system in balance, or an early signal that the balance is about to change in a way that has not happened since before the United States was a country. Both outcomes are consistent with the available data. Both are possible. And the only way to know which one you are watching is to watch it until the end, however the end comes. Part 7. The global and regional context. Let's zoom out for a moment. Not because the big picture changes the central story, as it doesn't, but because it adds a layer of context that's worth understanding, and worth understanding correctly. Because this is exactly the kind of information that gets misread in both directions, either dismissed entirely as irrelevant noise, or stitched together into a grand unified theory of imminent planetary catastrophe. Neither reading is right. So let's be precise about what the broader picture is actually saying. In roughly the same time window as the Brawley swarm, seismic activity at several points along the Pacific Plate boundary has been elevated. A magnitude 5.0 event occurred offshore Northern California. Activity near the southern terminus of the Cascadia subduction zone, the massive locked fault that runs along the Pacific Northwest coast from Northern California through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, has shown some elevated readings. In the Western Pacific, sequences in the Aleutian chain and near Fiji registered magnitude 5.0 and above. In South America, the Chilean subduction zone produced several events within its typical operational range. Now, before you start drawing lines on a map connecting all of those dots, and I know some of you already are, because that's exactly what human brains do with spatially distributed data, and honestly I respect the instinct even when it's wrong. Let me tell you what those dots actually mean. And more importantly, what they don't. The Pacific Plate boundary is one of the most seismically active features on the surface of this planet. It is not a fault. It is a system, an 8,000-mile long chain of subduction zones, transform faults, spreading centres, and volcanic arcs that encircles most of the Pacific Ocean and produces a staggering volume of seismic energy on a continuous basis. Dozens of significant earthquakes, magnitude 5.0 and above, occur along this system every single week. Every week, without exception, in quiet periods and active periods alike. When you're looking at a feature that produces that much seismicity as its baseline, elevated activity at multiple points along it in the same general time window is not automatically a signal. It may just be Tuesday. Claiming that the Brawley Swarm in Southern California is causally connected to a Chilean subduction earthquake, that one somehow influenced or triggered the other, would require a mechanism, a physical pathway through which stress or energy could travel from one location to the other and influence fault failure conditions at the destination. And there is no established mechanism for real-time triggering across those distances through solid crust. The seismic waves produced by a magnitude 4 or 5 earthquake attenuate lose energy as they travel through the Earth. By the time those waves have travelled thousands of miles, they carry nowhere near enough energy to meaningfully change the stress state on a remote fault system. The physics simply don't support a direct causal link across those distances at those magnitudes. If you're seeing someone on social media claim that the Brawley Swarm and the Chilean subduction events are part of the same connected sequence, they are working from pattern recognition, not from seismology. Those are different things. So the distant Pacific events, the Aleutians, Fiji, Chile, are context, not signal. They tell you that the Pacific Plate boundary is doing what the Pacific Plate boundary always does, generating seismicity across its enormous length on a continuous basis. That's worth knowing because it establishes the baseline, but it doesn't change the calculus on the Brawley Swarm. What is more relevant, genuinely more relevant, not just pattern matching relevant, is the regional picture closer to home, and here the story's a little more interesting and a little more carefully qualified. The magnitude 5.0 event that occurred offshore Northern California didn't happen in empty ocean. It happened along a section of the Cascadia system, specifically near the southern terminus of the main Cascadia locked zone, where the subduction interface transitions from its most dangerous fully locked configuration into a more complex structural zone. Cascadia, for context, is the subduction fault that last produced a great earthquake in January 1700, a magnitude 9 rupture that sent a tsunami across the Pacific to Japan and drowned entire coastal forests along the Pacific Northwest. It has been loading continuously since then. It is, in terms of accumulated strain and recurrence interval, in a similar position to the southern San Andreas, overdue by any reasonable measure, carrying centuries of stored elastic energy, and watched with the same kind of careful, sustained attention that the Coachella segment receives. A magnitude 5.0 near its southern terminus is not alarming in isolation, but it is not nothing either. The Walker Lane is the other piece of the regional picture worth mentioning. The Walker Lane is a system of northwest trending faults running through Nevada, roughly parallel to the Sierra Nevada, and it carries a significant fraction of Pacific North American plate motion that isn't accommodated on the San Andreas. Somewhere between 15 and 25% of total plate motion passes through this system rather than through the main San Andreas trace. It is not as famous as the San Andreas, it doesn't run through major population centres in the same way, and it doesn't generate the same public attention, but it is part of the same broad plate boundary system. It responds to the same regional stress field, and it has shown elevated activity over recent months in ways that monitoring teams have noted without yet fully characterised. Not alarming, not dramatic, but present. Here is what all of this does and does not tell us. What it does not tell us, that any of these systems are directly connected to the Brawley Swarm in a causal sense, that the Chilean events, or the Aleutian sequences, or even the Cascadia 5.0 are part of the same triggered cascade, that the Pacific Plate boundary is doing something unprecedented or collectively alarming. It is not. It is doing what it always does, at roughly the rate it always does it, across a system too large and too complex for any individual event cluster to be confidently read as a coordinated signal. What it does tell us, and this part matters, is that the Brawley Swarm is not occurring against a backdrop of regional quiescence. It is not a single anomalous signal in an otherwise calm system, which would actually make it easier to read in some ways. A single bright light in a dark room is easier to locate than a bright light in a room with several others burning. The broader plate boundary system is active, Multiple sections of it are showing elevated readings in the same general period. That doesn't prove that those sections are responding to a common stress driver, proving that would require data analysis over months or years, not the hours and days we currently have. Pattern recognition in noisy seismicity catalogues is one of the most reliable sources of false positives in the entire field, and serious researchers are careful about overclaiming connection where coincidence remains a fully viable explanation. But it does remove one of the easy dismissals: the argument that the Brawley swarm is a completely isolated, self-contained event occurring in an otherwise tranquil regional context. That argument is harder to make when the Walker Lane is elevated, when Cascadia's southern terminus just registered a 5.0, when the broader plate boundary system is running at an active rather than quiet baseline. Not impossible, not disproven, but harder. The distinction between a genuine regional stress field adjustment, a period where multiple sections of the plate boundary are simultaneously closer to failure, responding to a common loading signal, and a collection of independent coincidences that happen to cluster in the same time window, is one of the genuinely hard problems in observational seismology. You cannot resolve it in real time. You can only note that the conditions are consistent with either interpretation, be honest about that ambiguity, and keep watching as more data accumulates. So here is where the global and regional context leaves us. The distant Pacific events are background noise. Interesting, worth knowing, not causally connected to California at detectable levels. The regional picture, Walker Lane, Cascadia's southern end, the broader plate boundary activity, is context that makes the Brawley swarm slightly harder to read as a completely isolated event, without making it readable as part of a definitive connected sequence. The broader system is active, not quiescent. That's the honest summary. And then there is the signal, the actual signal, the thing that is not background noise and not ambiguous regional context, and not an interesting data point that requires months of analysis to interpret. 347 earthquakes, a relay zone directly coupled to 326 years of locked fault, a two-cluster geometry with a quiet central gap, an acceleration curve pointing in the wrong direction for 36 hours running. Whatever is happening in the Aleutians or Chile or Fiji is genuinely interesting science. It is not what keeps the seismologists in the Coachella Valley checking their monitoring feeds at 2 a.m. That job belongs entirely to the quiet gap sitting in the middle of the Brawley swarm, and the locked fault segment sitting just to its north. Those two features, one moving, one not, are the only parts of this global picture that actually matter to the question we've been asking since Saturday morning. Everything else is the Pacific Plate boundary doing what the Pacific Plate boundary has always done. The gap is doing something different. Part 8. The baseline outcome, most likely. Let's be honest about probability, because the honest probability, the one the data most strongly supports right now, in this moment, with everything we've laid out, is that this swarm fades. It winds down. It follows the Brawley template, the one this region has been running on repeat for decades, and it resolves into a quiet coda of diminishing activity over the next few days and weeks. No major rupture. No triggered San Andreas event. No catastrophe. Just another entry in the seismic catalogue, notable for its size, notable for its acceleration, but ultimately another chapter in the long, repetitive, slightly exhausting history of a volatile but manageable zone doing what volatile but manageable zones do. I know. After everything we've covered, the two-cluster geometry, the quiet central gap, the impossible tsunami warning, the 326-year locked fault sitting at the end of the stress relay, that probably feels like a disappointing place to land, but this is Project Nightwatch. We don't manufacture dread, we follow the data, and right now the data, honestly assessed, says the most likely outcome is the boring one. So let's start there. Let's actually build the case for boring, because boring deserves a real argument, not just a dismissal. The historical record supports the ordinary outcome. The Brawley Seismic Zone has produced significant swarms repeatedly over the past several decades, and the pattern is remarkably consistent. In 1981, a swarm involved hundreds of events and reached magnitudes in the mid-5s, larger than anything the current sequence has produced so far. Nobody remembers it as a precursor to catastrophe, because it wasn't. In 2012, another swarm produced a similar catalogue, peaking at magnitude 5.4, generating the same kind of attention and concern among monitoring teams, and then fading. The 2020 Westmoreland sequence ran through its entire cycle in a matter of days, produced a few headlines, and was absorbed back into the background noise of the region within a week. None of these sequences escalated into a major San Andreas rupture. Not one of them triggered the Coachella segment. Not one of them became the catastrophic event that the risk models have been describing for 3 decades. They were swarms. They ran their course. The system processed them, absorbed them, and moved on. That track record is not nothing. It is, in fact, substantial. The Brawley Zone has been producing swarms since before continuous seismic monitoring existed in this region, and every single one of them has resolved without triggering the larger system to the north. That's not a coincidence. It reflects something real about the physical character of this zone. Here's what I mean. The Brawley Zone, with its hot, thin crust and its densely fragmented network of small interconnected faults, is actually an unusually efficient stress bleeder. Think about what that means in practice. Instead of accumulating stress on a single locked surface until that surface fails catastrophically, the zone distributes deformation across hundreds, sometimes thousands, of small events spread across a broad area. It is, in a very literal sense, the opposite of the San Andreas. The San Andreas is a locked vault, storing energy for centuries. The Brawley Zone is a leaky pipe, constantly weeping pressure in small increments, and leaky pipes, almost by definition, don't explode. When the Brawley Zone produces a swarm, it is doing exactly what it was structurally designed to do. It is releasing energy diffusely, rather than banking it for a single catastrophic withdrawal. The 347 earthquakes in the current sequence have collectively released some amount of elastic strain energy from the region. Not enormous. We're not talking about the energy equivalent of a magnitude 6 here, not even close, but real, measurable, and not nothing. If the swarm continues and produces a few more moderate events in the magnitude 4 to 5 range, it may actually relieve enough local stress to marginally reduce the near-term probability of a larger event rather than increase it. The pressure valve venting, doing its job, keeping the system from building towards something worse, and the most likely trajectory from here is consistent with that picture. Based on the pattern established by prior Brawley swarms, the expected path forward is a gradual deceleration in event rate over the next 48 to 72 hours, with the possibility of one peak event somewhere in the magnitude 5 to 5.5 range before the sequence winds down and the seismometers go quiet. The acceleration we've seen in the first 36 hours is anomalous compared to the early phases of past swarms, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but swarms are inherently variable phenomena, and the Brawley Zone is complex enough that some departure from the average pattern is expected, and doesn't, by itself, mean the system is heading somewhere new. The question is always whether the departure is within the range of normal variability, or whether it has genuinely crossed outside it. And right now, honestly, with the data we have in real time, we cannot answer that question with certainty. We can only hold it. What we can say with confidence is that the rate acceleration by itself does not require a catastrophic interpretation. Swarm rates fluctuate for all kinds of mundane reasons. A new fault segment activating at the edge of the active zone. A fluid pressure front migrating into fresh, unfractured rock and unlocking a new set of small faults as it goes. A minor stress transfer from one of the larger events in the sequence, causing a momentary surge in adjacent sections before the system equilibrates. None of these mechanisms necessarily lead to escalation. Every single one of them can produce a brief, dramatic-looking acceleration followed by the expected decay curve. The system has enormous room to behave in ways that look alarming on a short timeline and still arrive at the ordinary outcome. We've seen it before, many times, and the ordinary outcome matters. I want to be direct about this because it's easy to get so absorbed in the interesting edge cases that you lose sight of what most of the people in this region are actually dealing with. Millions of people live within the hazard footprint of this swarm and the broader southern San Andreas system. Those people need accurate information, not inflated alarm. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake is not a dangerous earthquake. Your dog gives you the look. Maybe something falls off a shelf, you feel it, and then it's over. The communities of the Imperial Valley are not in danger from this swarm as it currently stands. The infrastructure is not threatened, schools are not at risk, water systems are fine. If this swarm follows the historical baseline, which again is the single most probable outcome, then the largest real-world consequence for the region is a few rattled nerves, some accelerometers running hot, a couple of news cycles, and a dataset that seismologists will spend the next year carefully analysing for insights into fault behaviour in the zone. That's a reasonable outcome. That's the expected outcome. Public communication about seismic hazard has a long and not particularly proud history of swinging between two failure modes. Crying wolf so often that people stop listening, and minimising real concerns so thoroughly that people aren't prepared when something genuine happens. Threading that needle responsibly means acknowledging the genuine anomalies in this sequence, and they are real. I haven't invented them, while anchoring the context in the historical record and the actual distribution of probable outcomes. The swarm will almost certainly fade. The southern San Andreas will remain locked. The long-term hazard, the ever-accumulating hazard of a fault that is now nearly twice its average rupture interval past due, will remain elevated but will not be fundamentally changed by whatever this swarm does or doesn't do in the next few days. That's the honest position. But I want to hold one sentence in the air for a moment before we move on, because it matters. Almost certainly is not the same as certainly. The anomalies in this sequence are real, not manufactured, not amplified for effect. The two-cluster geometry is unusual. The acceleration pattern is unusual for the second 24-hour window. The behaviour of the central gap is being watched closely by people who do this for a living, and they are not watching it casually. The combination of those features, in this specific location, at this specific moment in the 326-year accumulation history of the Coachella segment, produces a situation that cannot be responsibly dismissed with Brawley swarms happen all the time. They do. But this one is happening in a way that is not entirely consistent with the ones that came before, and acknowledging that while maintaining an accurate assessment of the most likely outcome isn't hedging, it isn't having it both ways. It is what honest science looks like when it is operating at the edge of what the data can resolve. The swarm will probably end quietly. The seismometers will gradually go calm. The monitoring teams will stand down from elevated watch. The accelerometers will go back to recording the ordinary background hum of a geologically restless region. And the southern San Andreas will continue to wait, as it has been waiting silently for 326 years, while the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate keep grinding past each other at 2 inches per year, storing every inch of that motion in the locked rock on either side of a fault that has not moved in living memory, or the memory before that, or the memory before that. Here is the thing about a system that has been waiting that long. The waiting has a physical price. It is not neutral. Every year of silence is a year of added strain. Every swarm that fades without triggering the main event does not reset the clock. It doesn't relieve the pressure, doesn't give the Coachella segment any credit toward a fresh start. It just adds one more year to the ledger. One more year of 2 inches of plate motion converted into stored elastic energy in locked rock. The 1981 swarm didn't reset the clock. The 2012 swarm didn't reset the clock. The 2020 swarm didn't reset the clock. And if this one fades quietly over the next 72 hours, it won't reset the clock either. The baseline outcome for this swarm is silence. Another chapter closes. The catalogue gets a new entry. The monitoring teams file their reports. The story, for now, ends without the ending that the geology says is eventually coming. But the baseline outcome for the Coachella segment, over a long enough timeline, is not silence. It has never been silence. It cannot be silence. The physics don't allow it. The plates are moving, the fault is locked, the energy is stored, and somewhere between now and a future that the geological record says is inevitable, something is going to be the last grain of sand on the pile. The question that nobody can answer, not the monitoring teams, not the models, not this channel, is whether we are watching that grain fall right now, or whether we are watching the pile grow a little taller and the swarm fade and the ledger add one more year to a debt that has been accumulating since before this country existed. That question is still open, and it will stay open until the sequence resolves, one way or the other. Part 9. The middle case. The most interesting scenario. Step back from the Brawley swarm for a moment. Just pull back. Stop looking at the individual seismograms. Stop counting the events. Stop watching the acceleration curve tick upward in real time. Expand the frame. Because there is a scenario sitting between routine swarm that fades without consequence and foreshock sequence for a major San Andreas rupture that doesn't get talked about enough, partly because it's less cinematic than the catastrophic version, and partly because it's harder to explain than the boring version. It is less dramatic than the second option, and more significant than the first, and it may be the most honest frame for what we are actually watching right now. Most serious seismic researchers, when they look at periods of elevated regional activity, reach for this scenario before they reach for either of the two extremes. It has a name in the technical literature, though the name is not particularly exciting: distributed stress adjustment. The idea is this: a period in which the plate boundary system is quietly reorganizing itself across multiple fault systems simultaneously, producing elevated seismicity across a broad region, but without any single fault producing the large event that would clearly announce that a shift has occurred. No headline earthquake, no obvious trigger, no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it changed. Just the system, rearranging itself in the dark, across hundreds of miles of crust over months or years, while the monitoring teams watch and measure and try to figure out whether what they're seeing is signal or noise. To understand why that's physically plausible, and not just a convenient middle ground that lets us avoid committing to either extreme, you need to zoom out further than Southern California. You need to think about the plate boundary as a system, not a line. The boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate is roughly 800 miles long in California alone. 800 miles of active, stressed, geologically complex crust, loaded continuously by the same 2 inches per year of plate motion. That stress does not distribute uniformly across the system. It does not load every fault at the same rate or discharge from every fault on the same schedule. Different segments have different rock types, different fault geometries, different fluid environments, different histories of past rupture. The result is a stress field that is constantly evolving, shifting, redistributing, loading some areas faster than others, and occasionally triggering cascades of adjustment across multiple systems in ways that look, from the outside, like elevated regional seismicity without an obvious cause. Seismologists call these periods seismic clusters, and they show up clearly in the historical record if you know how to look for them. The 1950s, 60s and 70s were a relatively active period for California seismicity, a sustained window of elevated activity across multiple fault systems that stands out against the longer-term average. Then a period of relative quiet. Then the 1990s, which produced landers in 1992, a magnitude 7.3 rupture in the Mojave Desert that remains one of the most scientifically important earthquakes in the modern instrumental record, and Northridge in 1994, a magnitude 6.7 that caused catastrophic damage across the Los Angeles basin. Many researchers interpreted that decade as a period of elevated stress state across the broader California fault system, with multiple faults simultaneously closer to failure than the long-term average would predict. Now look at the period from roughly 2010 to the present. El Mayor Cucapa in 2010, a magnitude 7.2 rupture in Baja California that ruptured multiple fault segments and produced detectable stress changes across the Southern California region. Elevated activity along the southern San Andreas in the years following. The Ridgecrest sequence in 2019, a magnitude 6.4 followed within 34 hours by a magnitude 7.1, rupturing previously unmapped faults in the Mojave, producing Coulomb stress changes that were calculated to load sections of the Garlock Fault and through it, indirectly influenced the broader regional stress field. And now, in 2025, the Brawley swarm 347 earthquakes in 36 hours, accelerating geometrically unusual, sitting directly on the stress relay that feeds the most overdue fault rupture in California. Is that a meaningful temporal cluster? Is it a period of elevated regional seismicity reflecting a genuine broader stress adjustment across the plate boundary system? Or is it a random sample from a noisy catalogue that happens to include several significant events in the same 15-year window? And the human brain, which is, I cannot stress this enough, extraordinarily good at finding patterns that are not there, is connecting dots that don't actually connect. Honestly, that question cannot be answered with confidence in real time. It cannot. Seismicity catalogues are noisy by nature. Pattern recognition is both the greatest tool in the seismologist's kit and the greatest source of false positives. The entire history of earthquake prediction is littered with patterns that looked compelling and turned out to mean nothing, and with sequences that produced no detectable precursory signal at all before the main event arrived. This is a genuine epistemic hazard, and serious researchers guard against it carefully. sometimes to the point of being reluctant to say anything that might be interpreted as a pattern claim until the data has been processed and peer-reviewed and stress-tested against alternative interpretations. But guarding against false pattern recognition is not the same as refusing to engage with real physical arguments. And there are real physical arguments for why a distributed stress adjustment might be underway right now across the broader plate boundary region, arguments that go beyond Southern California. The Walker Lane fault system in Nevada runs roughly parallel to the Sierra Nevada, curving northward through western Nevada and into eastern California. It carries a significant fraction of Pacific North American plate motion that isn't accommodated on the San Andreas, somewhere between 15 and 25% of total plate motion, depending on which section you're measuring. That's not a trivial amount. And the Walker Lane has shown elevated activity over the past decade in ways that monitoring teams have noted without fully characterizing. It is not a system that generates the kind of catastrophic ruptures the San Andreas is capable of. The faults are smaller, the locked sections shorter, but it is a system that responds to the same regional stress field, and elevated activity there is at minimum consistent with a broader regional adjustment. The Wasatch Front in Utah sits at the far eastern edge of the Basin and Range province, the broad zone of crustal extension that stretches from the Sierra Nevada to the Rocky Mountains. It has drawn increased attention from monitoring teams in recent years, with elevated small magnitude seismicity and slow geodetic signals that suggest the stress field in that region is not at rest. The Wasatch is not directly connected to the San Andreas system, but it is part of the same broad plate boundary zone, responding to the same large-scale forces. And then there is Cascadia, the Cascadia subduction zone, the massive locked fault that runs offshore from Northern California through Oregon and Washington and into southern British Columbia, has not produced a great earthquake since January 26, 1700. That rupture was a magnitude 9 or close to it. The evidence for it is preserved in drowned coastal forests, tsunami deposits along the Pacific coast of North America, and Japanese historical records of an orphan tsunami, a wave that arrived on Japanese shores without a locally felt earthquake, which allowed researchers to work backward and pin the rupture date to within hours. Since 1700, Cascadia has been locked and loading, accumulating strain for 325 years, almost exactly as long as the southern San Andreas. The system shows episodic slow-slip events, stretches of days to weeks where sections of the subduction interface slip slowly and silently, too gradually to generate felt earthquakes but detectable by GPS and seismometers, sensitive enough to catch the tremor signal associated with the slip. These slow-slip events are ongoing adjustments of the plate interface. They are the subduction zone breathing, not releasing its stored energy, but redistributing stress within the system. None of these systems, Walker Lane, Wasatch, Cascadia, are directly wired to the Brawley Seismic Zone the way the Brawley Zone is wired to the San Andreas. There is no physical mechanism by which activity on the Cascadia subduction interface directly triggers earthquakes in the Imperial Valley. The distances are too large, the stress transfer pathways too indirect, the intervening crust too heterogeneous. Anyone who tries to draw a straight causal line between those systems is overreaching the data. But they are all responding to the same broad-scale plate motion. They're all embedded in the same regional stress field. And when multiple sections of a plate boundary system show elevated activity in the same general period, not simultaneously, not in obvious causal sequence, but within the same decade-scale window, it can reflect a genuine reorganization of the regional stress field rather than a collection of independent coincidences. That's the middle case. That's the scenario that occupies the space between boring and catastrophic. In this scenario, the Brawley swarm fades, as swarms almost always do. The event rate decelerates over the next 48 to 72 hours. The monitoring teams stand down from elevated watch. The headlines move on, but the regional stress state does not return to baseline. Instead, it remains elevated for months to years, producing a sustained period of increased seismicity across multiple fault systems, more magnitude 5s and 6s than the long-term average, distributed across a broad region, each one individually unremarkable but collectively reflecting a stress field that is actively reorganizing. No single catastrophic event necessarily follows. No shakeout scenario rupture. No moment of clarity where everything suddenly makes sense. Just a sustained, ambiguous, slightly elevated hum across the plate boundary system, each event nudging probabilities fractionally, the monitoring teams watching and measuring and updating their models without ever getting the clean resolution that would let them say definitively, yes, this was a cluster, and now it's over. And through all of it, the southern San Andreas continues to load, silently, without participating in the regional adjustment happening around it. Every moderate earthquake on the Walker Lane, every slow slip event on Cascadia, every swarm in the Brawley Zone that fades without triggering the Coachella segment, none of them relieve the accumulated strain on that locked 200-mile section. They may even add to it through Coulomb stress transfer in small but non-zero increments. The fault at the centre of everything just keeps waiting, keeps accumulating, keeps adding to a ledger that is already 326 years deep. The middle case does not end with an earthquake. That's the thing about it that makes it both less frightening and somehow more unsettling than the catastrophic scenario. It ends with a question that doesn't resolve, a question that persists through the moderate events and the elevated monitoring periods, and the swarms that fade and the slow slip signals and all the other data that the system keeps generating without ever quite answering the central question. How long can a 326-year locked fault continue to wait while the systems around it adjust? At what point does the adjustment of those surrounding systems stop functioning as a pressure valve and start functioning as the last series of small pushes before the structure gives way? Because the scenario that keeps researchers awake at 2 a.m. is not the rupture that arrives without warning. It is the rupture that arrives at the end of a clearly visible, carefully documented, extensively modelled escalating sequence. A sequence where, looking back, every signal was present and legible, where the system behaved exactly as the physics predicted, right up until the moment it didn't. The Brawley swarm may be nothing more than a volatile transfer zone doing its job under elevated load, exactly the way it has done a dozen times before, exactly the way it will do a dozen times again. Or it may be one chapter in a longer sequence that eventually, through some combination of accumulated strain and incremental stress transfer, and one final perturbation from one final swarm, arrives at the moment that seismologists have been modelling and planning for and losing sleep over for 30 years. Both of those possibilities are alive right now, simultaneously, unresolved, suspended in the ambiguity of a 36-hour-old sequence that is still accelerating, still speaking, still refusing to show its hand. The middle case is where those two possibilities coexist for as long as the data stays ambiguous. It is the least satisfying scenario, the hardest to communicate, and probably the most accurate description of where we actually are. And ambiguous, genuinely, uncomfortably, honestly ambiguous, is exactly what the data is right now. Part 10, the aggressive scenario, carefully framed. There is a scenario that gets discussed in very careful, precise, deliberately hedged language in seismological research papers and conference presentations, and then it gets discussed in very different language everywhere else, in comment sections, in viral posts, in the kind of breathless coverage that uses the word imminent the way a chef uses salt, liberally and without much thought for the consequences. This scenario deserves better than both of those treatments. It deserves to be laid out clearly, honestly, and with the appropriate framing, because the framing is not just context. The framing is the difference between useful risk awareness and useless paralyzing fear, and those are not the same thing even though they can look identical from a distance. So let's name it, let's describe it, and let's be precise about what it is and what it isn't. The scenario is this. The current Brawley swarm is a foreshock sequence, not background noise, not a routine stress bleed from a volatile transfer zone, not another entry in a long catalogue of swarms that faded without consequence. A foreshock sequence, meaning the opening act of something larger, the system loading itself in the specific way that precedes a major rupture, the crust telegraphing, in the only language it has, that something is coming. Here's how that scenario would unfold, mechanically, step by step. The two cluster geometry, those two dense clouds of seismicity at either end of the active zone, with the quiet 12-kilometre gap between them, represents a section of fault that is being loaded simultaneously from both sides. The clusters are moving, the gap is not, and as we covered earlier, a fault segment that is not moving while the segments on either side of it are active is not necessarily a fault segment that is safe. It may be a fault segment that is accumulating stress faster than it can release it, being squeezed from both directions, getting closer to its failure threshold with every event at either end. In this scenario, over the next days to weeks, not necessarily tonight, not necessarily this weekend, but within what geologists would call a short window, the central gap fails. The stress that has been loading it from both sides finally exceeds the frictional strength of the fault surface, and the locked section ruptures. That rupture propagates. It moves northward, following the structural grain of the fault system, reaching the southern terminus of the San Andreas Fault. And the San Andreas, carrying 326 years of accumulated strain, already at or near its failure threshold, already loaded to a degree that has no historical precedent in the instrumental record, responds. The Coachella segment ruptures. Depending on how the rupture propagates from there, two outcomes are possible. In the more contained version, the rupture stays within the Coachella segment, roughly 60 miles of fault, releasing energy in the magnitude 7.5 to 7.8 range. Devastating for the Coachella Valley, severe shaking across the Inland Empire and Greater Los Angeles Basin, significant infrastructure damage across one of the most densely developed corridors in California. In the more extended version, the rupture doesn't stop at the Coachella segment. It cascades northward, jumping to the San Bernardino segment, then to the Mojave segment, propagating through connected fault sections in a multi-segment rupture that reaches magnitude 7.8 to 8.2 or above. That is the scenario that California has been planning for under the name Shakeout for over 15 years. And here I want to stop and make something very clear, because this is where the framing matters most. The Shakeout scenario is not a fringe concern invented by catastrophists. It is the official planning earthquake of the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. It is the scenario that FEMA uses for regional preparedness exercises. It is the scenario that the Southern California Earthquake Center has been refining and updating for decades. The damage modelling for this scenario is extensive and peer-reviewed. The infrastructure vulnerability analysis, which highways fail, which water systems rupture, which hospital structures are at risk, is well documented and regularly updated. The response planning is real, ongoing, and taken seriously by professionals whose job is to prepare for things they hope never happen. Scientists and emergency managers engage with this scenario not because they enjoy imagining catastrophe, but because the physics support it and the geological record demands it. The question has never been whether this scenario is physically possible. It clearly is. The question, the only question, is whether the current Brawley swarm is a meaningful signal that this scenario is becoming more likely in the near term. And here, the honest answer, the only defensible answer, is we do not know. We do not have a reliable method for distinguishing foreshock sequences from ordinary swarms in real time. Full stop. This is not a gap that better equipment would close tomorrow, or that a new algorithm is about to solve. It is a fundamental limitation rooted in the physical complexity of fault systems. Approximately 5 to 10% of major earthquakes are preceded by foreshocks that, in hindsight, look recognizably like a swarm. Distributed seismicity, no clear main shock, accelerating rate, unusual spatial geometry. The pattern, after the fact, is often visible and interpretable. Before the fact in real time, it is indistinguishable from the majority of swarms that show exactly the same characteristics and simply fade. There is currently no algorithm, no sensor, no measurement, no threshold in seismological science that reliably separates the 5 to 10% of swarms that are foreshock sequences from the 90+% that are not. The same sequence of events that preceded El Mayor Cucapa in 2010, the swarm, the two-cluster geometry, the accelerating rate, the quiet gap, would, on 90% or more of occasions when it occurred elsewhere, have produced no major rupture at all. It would have faded. It would have been forgotten. It would be a footnote in a catalogue somewhere, not a case study in earthquake science. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. I want to be direct about that because it's easy to hear we don't know and interpret it as the scientists haven't figured this out yet. That's not what it means. It means the physical complexity of fault systems at seismogenic depths, the heterogeneity of the crust, the three-dimensional evolution of the stress field, the dependence of failure thresholds on variables like pore pressure and microscale fault geometry that we cannot measure directly, is genuinely irreducible with current technology. We can put seismometers on the surface. We can measure ground motion with extraordinary precision. We can map fault geometry with GPS and LiDAR and INSAR. What we cannot do is put a sensor on the fault surface itself, 10 kilometers below ground, and read the stress state in real time. The gap between what we can measure and what we would need to measure to make reliable short-term rupture predictions is not a gap we are close to closing. It is a genuine frontier. So what makes the aggressive scenario worth naming explicitly if the probability is low and the uncertainty is irreducible? 4 things. And I want to walk through each one carefully, because together they form the argument for why the people who watch this for a living are watching this particular sequence with something more than routine attention. The first is the geometry. The 2-cluster pattern with a central quiet gap is not a random configuration. It has a specific historical echo that is difficult to dismiss. The pre-rupture seismicity before El Mayor Cucapa in 2010 organised into a recognisably similar pattern, 2 zones of concentrated activity with a relatively quiet zone between them. In that case, the rupture initiated near the gap and propagated outward. The Brawley geometry is not identical to the El Mayor precursor geometry. The fault systems are different, the structural context is different, the stress history is different. But the resemblance is close enough that geologists do not look at the current map and feel relaxed. They look at it and pay closer attention. The second is the acceleration pattern. The rate of earthquakes in this sequence increased through the second 24-hour window rather than decreasing. That is the wrong direction for a system dissipating energy in a controlled Omori law fashion. It is consistent instead with a system that is importing stress faster than it is releasing it. A relay station running under increasing load rather than decreasing load. That is not proof of escalation. But it is inconsistent with the picture of a zone quietly bleeding off excess pressure and returning to baseline. The third is the location. This is not a swarm happening somewhere in the California desert that is geologically interesting but structurally isolated. This is a swarm happening in the specific zone that directly, mechanically, structurally feeds stress into the southern terminus of the San Andreas Fault. The Brawley Zone is not near the most overdue fault rupture in California. It is the plumbing that connects to it. Every stress perturbation produced by this swarm propagates into a fault that is already carrying 326 years of accumulated strain. A fault where, as we discussed in the context of Coulomb stress transfer, even a small increment of added stress is not trivial when the cup is already that full. The fourth is context. The broader regional stress field, as we covered in the middle case section, is not in a state of quiescence. It is in a state of elevated activity across multiple systems. The Brawley swarm is not occurring against a backdrop of regional calm that would make it easier to read as an isolated, self-contained event. It is occurring against a backdrop of a plate boundary system that has been expressing elevated stress across multiple fault systems for the better part of 15 years. That context doesn't prove connection, but it removes one of the easy dismissals. None of these 4 factors standing alone would justify elevated alarm. None of them, individually, constitute evidence that the aggressive scenario is likely. But together, the geometry, the acceleration, the location, the context, they constitute a set of conditions that seismologists take seriously. They justify elevated attention, and the distinction between alarm and attention is one of the most important distinctions in risk communication, so let me be precise about it. Alarm means changing your behavior based on a prediction. It means evacuating, stockpiling, treating an uncertain future event as sufficiently probable that you reorganize your present around it. That is not where the science is right now. Seismologists monitoring this sequence are not at the alarm level. Attention means watching more closely, updating models as new data arrives, increasing the frequency of monitoring, being prepared to revise assessments rapidly if the sequence evolves in ways that shift the probability distribution, being ready rather than reactive. That is exactly where the science is. The public sits somewhere between those 2 states, at the awareness level, understanding that something unusual is occurring in a location with significant long-term hazard, knowing enough about the situation to follow official communications intelligently if the assessment changes, continuing normal activities because the current data does not support disrupting them, while not dismissing the situation as routine because it is not entirely routine. The aggressive scenario is possible. It is not probable. It is not the expected outcome. Based on everything we know right now, the most likely outcome remains the ordinary one. The swarm fades, the sequence resolves, the southern San Andreas stays locked and continues accumulating strain in silence. But possible and not probable is not the same as impossible. And in a system this loaded, a fault 2 centuries past its average rupture interval, directly connected to a zone of accelerating geometrically unusual seismicity, the tail of the probability distribution is not a tail you can simply ignore. It is a tail you name, describe, monitor carefully, and hold honestly in your awareness without letting it metastasize into something it isn't. That is what the researchers are doing right now, naming it, watching it, holding it. The next 48 hours will tell us more than the first 36. The evolution of the rate, whether it continues climbing or begins to decay. The behaviour of the central gap, whether it stays quiet or begins to fill with small events. The emergence or absence of any northward migration in the seismicity. These are the signals that will update the probability distribution in one direction or the other. For now, the aggressive scenario lives in the error bars, not at the centre of the estimate, not even close to the centre, but not outside the range of physical possibility either. And in a system with 326 years of stored energy sitting at the end of the relay station that is currently the most seismically active zone in the western United States, the error bars deserve to be read carefully, because that's exactly what the people watching this are doing, right now. At 2 a.m, with fresh coffee and live seismograms, and the particular expression of people who know exactly what they're looking at, and are not yet sure what it means. Part 11. The real unanswered question. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this video, the beginning of the sequence. Saturday morning. The first tremor registering on the seismometers in the Imperial Valley. Not a bang, not a single dramatic rupture that announced itself and demanded attention, but a murmur, a distributed low-level hum across a 36-mile corridor of fractured desert crust. The first of what would become 347 individual earthquakes in 36 hours of continuous ground motion, a relay zone in hot, fluid-saturated, geologically ancient rock, sitting at the southern end of the longest locked fault in California. 2 clusters of seismicity organising themselves at either end of the active zone, a quiet gap between them that nobody is taking their eyes off, an acceleration curve pointing in exactly the wrong direction, and a fault, 200 miles long, locked since approximately the year 1690, sitting at the northern end of all of it, carrying 326 years of accumulated elastic strain in every millimetre of its surface, silent and loaded and waiting. That's the whole picture. That's everything we've built over the course of this video, assembled in one place. Now strip it all away. Remove the global context, the probability distributions, the stress transfer equations, the Coulomb calculations, the b-values, the Omori decay curves, the historical analogues, the shakeout scenarios. Remove every layer of analysis and interpretation and scientific framework. Go down to the bedrock of what the data is actually saying, and you find a single question that has not been answered. That cannot be answered yet with the information currently available by anyone on the planet. Is this swarm releasing stress from the southern San Andreas system? Or is it redistributing that stress in a way that brings the system closer to a failure that 326 years of tectonic loading have made physically inevitable? That question is genuinely open. I want to be precise about what that means, because genuinely open is a phrase that can be misread in 2 opposite directions. It does not mean probably fine, we just don't want to say so. It does not mean secretly alarming, we just don't want to cause panic. It means the actual state of scientific understanding at this specific moment, with this specific data, in this specific sequence, is that the question has not resolved. The seismologists monitoring the Brawley Zone right now do not know the answer. They are watching the sequence evolve in real time, updating their models as new events are recorded, processing focal mechanism data as it becomes available, running stress calculations that will take days to fully refine, and holding the uncertainty. The way good scientists always hold uncertainty. Openly, honestly, without performing false confidence in either direction, and without pretending to a resolution that the data does not yet support. That is not a comfortable position. It is, however, the correct one. So what are they watching for? What are the specific signals that will help resolve the question over the next days to weeks? There are 4 forward indicators that matter, and understanding them gives you the tools to follow this story intelligently as it develops, rather than waiting for someone to tell you what to think after the fact. The first indicator is migration pattern, specifically whether the seismicity migrates northward. Right now, the active zone is centered in the Brawley Seismic Zone proper, in the transfer zone between the San Andreas and the Imperial Fault. If the locus of activity begins to shift north, toward the Salton Sea and toward the southern terminus of the San Andreas, that pattern would be consistent with a fluid-driven swarm front advancing through the fault network, pressurized fluid moving through the crust, reducing friction on each new fault segment it reaches, unlocking a cascade of small events as it goes, progressively approaching the locked fault to the north. Fluid-driven swarm migration is a known phenomenon. It happens. And when the migration is headed toward a critically stressed fault rather than away from it, the concern level rises. Northward migration would not be definitive evidence of impending rupture. It would not be a red alert. But it would narrow the probability distribution meaningfully toward the more serious end of the range, and it would almost certainly trigger a formal reassessment from monitoring agencies. The second indicator is the central gap. That 12-kilometre quiet zone sitting between the two active clusters, the part of the map that looks like a held breath surrounded by 347 earthquakes, is the single most watched patch of real estate in Southern California right now. If events begin filling that gap, if the quiet zone starts to close with small earthquakes, there are two interpretations, and neither of them is entirely reassuring. The first is that a previously locked section of fault is beginning to slip, that the stress loading from both sides has finally started to overcome the frictional strength of the fault surface in the gap, and the gap is activating. The second is that fluid pressure has migrated into the gap from one or both sides, reducing the effective normal stress on the fault surface there, and allowing it to begin releasing in small events. Both interpretations represent a change in the state of the gap, and both warrant heightened attention. The benign reading of the gap, the one that suggests the aggressive scenario is less likely, is that the gap remains quiet while the clusters at either end gradually decay. A quiet gap in a decaying swarm is more consistent with the stress shadow interpretation, where the gap is structurally protected from the activity on either side rather than being loaded by it. That's the reading everybody is hoping for. But hoping is not the same as observing, and right now the gap is still there, still quiet, still surrounded by an active and accelerating sequence. The third indicator is the magnitude ceiling. This swarm has been running for 36 hours, with a largest event of magnitude 4.7. That's not a small number. You feel a 4.7, things move, your dog looks betrayed. But in the context of a swarm this large and this sustained, it's relatively modest. The question going forward is whether the magnitude ceiling holds or whether it breaks. If the sequence produces a single event significantly larger than anything so far, something in the magnitude 5.0 to 5.5 range, and if that event occurs without the surrounding rate decaying in response, it might indicate that the sequence is transitioning from distributed swarm behaviour towards something more hierarchical. A hierarchy, in seismological terms, means one event is becoming dominant, and a dominant event in a swarm is sometimes a main shock in the process of emerging. That's not a certainty. Magnitude 5 events occur in swarms without becoming main shocks all the time. But the combination of a higher magnitude ceiling and a sustained or accelerating rate around it would be a signal worth taking seriously. Conversely, if the largest events stay in the 4.0 to 4.7 range and the rate begins showing the first signs of decay, even slight decay, that's a signal pointing in the other direction, toward the historical baseline, toward the boring outcome that remains the most probable single scenario. The fourth indicator is time itself, and this one is the most underrated of the four, so I want to spend a moment on it. Every hour that passes without escalation incrementally reduces the probability of the aggressive scenario. This is not wishful thinking, it's statistics rooted in the empirical record of foreshock sequences. Foreshock sequences historically tend to escalate relatively quickly. The window between the onset of anomalous swarm behaviour and a major triggered rupture, in cases where escalation has occurred, tends to be measured in days to a couple of weeks, not months. The longer a swarm runs without producing the larger event its geometry and acceleration patterns seem to threaten, the more the data updates against the aggressive interpretation and toward the ordinary one. A swarm that shows all the concerning features of a foreshock sequence, the two-cluster geometry, the acceleration, the quiet gap, the location, but then decays over the course of a week without producing a larger event, gets retrospectively reclassified. Not a foreshock sequence, an unusual but non-escalating swarm. Time is information. It is, in fact, one of the most valuable pieces of information the monitoring teams will collect over the coming days. And right now, the sequence is 36 hours old, still accelerating, and still speaking. What makes this particular moment in the sequence so difficult, for scientists, for anyone covering it, for anyone watching it from the outside, is that we are sitting at the point of maximum uncertainty, early enough that no definitive patterns have resolved, late enough that the anomalies are clearly visible and cannot be responsibly dismissed. The seismograms are full of data. The data has not yet told a complete story. We're in the middle of a sentence, watching it form word by word, trying to interpret meaning before the sentence is finished. And the middle of a sentence is the hardest possible place to extract meaning from, because the ending changes everything. The same opening clause can resolve into reassurance or catastrophe depending on what comes next. And right now, we don't know what comes next. The hardest discipline in watching a system like this, for scientists, for science communicators, for anyone trying to engage honestly with genuine uncertainty, is holding that uncertainty without filling it, without reaching for false reassurance because the uncertainty is uncomfortable, without reaching for catastrophic extrapolation because the anomalies are real and the stakes are high, and catastrophe is, in its own dark way, a more narratively satisfying resolution than ambiguity. The data says, this is unusual. The data says, the geometry is not what we typically see in routine Brawley swarms. The data says, this zone is directly coupled to a fault that has no remaining room in its ledger. But the data also says, most swarms fade. Most anomalies resolve into ordinary outcomes. Most moments that look, in real time, like they could be something turn out to be nothing. The vast majority of them. The track record of this specific zone, over its specific documented history, is one of repeated swarms that ultimately resolved without triggering the major system fault to the north. 1981, 2012, 2020. Swarms, fade, catalogue entry, move on. That track record is not zero. It is substantial. It is the primary reason the most probable single outcome remains the ordinary one. But it is also not a guarantee, and here is the part that the track record cannot tell you, the part that the historical analogy quietly obscures. The track record was compiled during a period when the southern San Andreas was already overdue. Every one of those past Brawley swarms, 1981, 2012, 2020, occurred against the backdrop of a fault that was already past its average recurrence interval. Every one of them faded without triggering the Coachella segment. And every one of them in fading did not reset the clock, did not reduce the accumulated strain, did not give the fault any credit toward a fresh start. They just added one more year, one more decade, to a ledger that was already running long when they happened and is running longer still now. The 1981 swarm faded, and the southern San Andreas kept waiting. The 2012 swarm faded, and the southern San Andreas kept waiting. The 2020 swarm faded and the southern San Andreas kept waiting. Every year of silence since 1700 is a year of additional stored energy. Every swarm that doesn't trigger the main event moves the system one increment further along a timeline that has only one possible terminus. Not maybe, not probably, certainly over a long enough horizon. The physics are unambiguous about that part. The San Andreas will rupture. I want to say that plainly, without hedging, because it is not a prediction. It is a statement of physics. The Pacific Plate is moving. The North American Plate is moving. The fault between them is locked. The energy is accumulating. The rupture will happen. This is not a question of if. It has never been a question of if. It is only ever a question of when, and a question of whether the when is influenced, even marginally, even fractionally, by what is happening right now in the Brawley Seismic Zone. That influence may be zero. The swarm may be a self-contained event, releasing local strain without meaningfully perturbing the stress state of the Coachella segment to the north, and the San Andreas may be no closer to failure tonight than it was on Friday morning. That is a possible outcome. The influence may be infinitesimal, a Coulomb stress change so small it is measurable in thousandths of a bar, nudging the probability of Coachella rupture by a fraction of a percent. a perturbation so tiny it is indistinguishable from noise against the backdrop of 3 centuries of accumulated strain. Also, a possible outcome. Or the influence may be, in some small but real and physically non-trivial way, the last increment. The final grain of sand on a pile that has been building since before the United States existed, since before Los Angeles existed, since before anyone was alive to feel the last time the ground here moved in the way it is capable of moving. Not the cause of the rupture, the plates are the cause, the locked fault is the cause, 3 centuries of unrelieved tectonic stress is the cause, but the final perturbation that tips the system from locked to failing. The grain that starts the avalanche, even though every grain before it was equally necessary, equally part of the pile, equally complicit in the physics of what happens next. We are watching the system decide, not as a metaphor, literally. The seismometers are running right now, the monitoring feeds are live. The events are being recorded and located and catalogued in real time by automated systems and human analysts, working through whatever this is alongside the rest of us. And somewhere beneath the Imperial Valley, in that 36-mile corridor of hot, fractured, fluid-saturated crust that has been the mechanical intermediary between 2 great fault systems for millions of years, that has been doing this job since long before there were instruments to measure it. 347 earthquakes are rearranging the stress field in ways that we can measure, can partially model, can reason about carefully, but cannot yet fully interpret. The scientists will keep watching. They will update their assessments as new data arrives. They will run more refined stress models when the focal mechanism data finishes processing. They will publish their analyses, weeks from now, months from now, with the clarity that hindsight provides, the kind of clarity that is only available after the story is resolved and you can finally read the sentence from beginning to end and understand what it was saying all along. But right now, in this window, in this 36-hour-old sequence that is still accelerating and still unresolved, the clarity isn't available, the analysis isn't finished, the story hasn't ended. At some point in the coming days, or probably, the swarm will either escalate or it will not. The central gap will either fill with small events, or it will stay quiet while the clusters decay around it. The migration pattern will either develop northward toward the San Andreas, or it will stay stationary. The magnitude ceiling will either hold at 4.7 or it will break. The rate will either continue climbing, or it will finally begin the decay that every past Brawley swarm has eventually shown. The story will resolve into one of 3 chapters. The ordinary ending, where the catalogue gets a new entry and the monitoring team stand down. The regional adjustment, where the swarm fades but the broader stress field remains elevated and the region enters a sustained period of heightened moderate seismicity. Or the beginning of something that seismologists have been modelling for 30 years, that California has been planning for under the name shakeout, that the geological record says is not a possibility but an inevitability. But right now, in this specific window, the story is unresolved. The ground is still moving. The rate is still climbing. The southern San Andreas is still locked. 326 years of patience stored in every millimetre of its surface, unbroken since before this nation existed. And the Brawley Seismic Zone, the relay station, the transfer zone, the hot fragmented crust between one great fault system and another, is lit up with 347 pieces of evidence that the system, whatever it is doing, is not at rest. The swarm will end, everything ends, the sequence will resolve, the seismometers will eventually go quiet, or they will record something that changes everything. And either way, the uncertainty will lift and the picture will clarify and we will know, in hindsight, what this was. The question, the one the seismologists are sitting with right now, the one the data has not answered, the one that 326 years of accumulated silence makes impossible to wave away, is whether the swarm ends the story, or whether it ends the silence. Because the San Andreas has been quiet for a very, very long time. Longer than this country has existed. Longer than anyone alive has been alive. Longer than living memory, and the memory before that, and the memory before that. And in the physics of tectonic systems, quiet is not the same as still. Quiet is what accumulation looks like from the outside. It is what 3 centuries of stored elastic energy feels like to the people living above it, which is to say, it feels like nothing at all, right up until the moment it doesn't. It is the surface expression of a process that does not stop when you stop paying attention to it. That does not negotiate with the schedules of the people living in its shadow. That does not send a formal warning before the ledger comes due. 347 earthquakes, 36 miles of fractured fluid-saturated crust, 36 hours of continuous ground motion with no sign of stopping, a federal monitoring system that issued a geographically impossible warning 4 minutes into the sequence, and a fault 200 miles long, locked since before the nation was born, sitting silent and loaded at the northern end of the relay station that is currently the most seismically active zone in the western United States. We are watching the system decide. The only question that matters, the one that everything else in this video has been building toward, the one that the data has not yet answered and cannot answer until the sequence resolves, is whether we are watching the decision, or whether we are watching the moment just before it.